Today we're in Unit 9, Day 2, and we are going to be talking about the end of the Cold War and the presidency of George H.W. Bush. So let's jump right in. So that brings us to the election of 1988. Last time we had left off talking about the Reagan Revolution and the Conservative Revolution. You'll see as kind of some backstory of the election of 1988, the Democrats had regained control of the Senate in 1986. And you're going to see that one thing with our government and one thing with the American people is that the American people tend to prefer divided government over a unified government, meaning the Democrats, Republicans being in control of all of the government. We've seen throughout history in many different ways that Americans tend to prefer there to be some differing views within the government, and that tends to be the way that our government always falls. So, yeah, the Democrats had regained control in 1986, and in the election 1988, you're going to have Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis once again running versus Vice President George H.W. Bush. Now, George H.W. Bush, of course, would be able to ride on the coattails of a very, very popular president in Ronald Reagan. Now, the big promise that George H.W. Bush is going to make is a promise not to raise taxes, and in his tagline from his campaign was "Read my lips, no new taxes." Now, keep that in mind because that is going to come back to haunt him in a little bit. Now, obviously, Bush would easily win the election there. Again, like I said, riding on the coattails of Ronald Reagan, a very, very popular president. But the Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate would grow. So again, talking about Americans preferring divided government, and that is what you are going to see. So at the beginning of Bush's presidency, you're going to see that the communist world really starts to change. And you're going to see a lot of changes in the communist world throughout, like Europe and not really Asia, more so Europe. So in May and June of 1989, you would have pro-democracy Chinese students over in China would protest for freedom in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. You're going to see that this does get crushed. The Chinese government would crush this protest with tanks, killing hundreds of people and ending the challenge to their authority. Probably the most famous image that you're going to see come out of this is the one that I have on the slides there of the single solitary man there standing in front of the tanks. They actually don't know what happened to this man. Some people believe that he was arrested and then executed shortly later. Some people said that he escaped. Nobody really knows what happened to that man. So you have that happening over in China. Again, the Chinese government generally deals pretty harshly with these sort of things, and you don't see them turn into any bigger uprising. That will be different, though, over in Europe. In Eastern Europe, Gorbachev would declare that he would no longer use the Soviet military to support communist government there. So remember, the Soviets after World War II had promised free elections in places such as Poland and these other Eastern countries there over in Europe. That hadn't really happened, and communist governments have been put in place there. But you'll see that once he says that the armies aren't going to be in there, that you're going to have communist governments fall in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and in Romania. So very quickly, these communist governments are going to fall. So when we are talking about the Soviet Union, we really need to look at why did the Soviet Union fall? What was the reason? Why did it eventually fail? And you're going to see there's going to be a lot of internal pressures as well as external pressures that lead to the failure of the Soviet Union. So number one, increasing Soviet military expenses to compete with the U.S. We talked about during Ronald Reagan's administration how he increased military spending by a good amount here in the United States. One of the specific reasons to do that was specifically to put pressure on the Soviet Union. Now, if you look at this chart here, you'll see the Soviet Union actually was pretty steady in their growth of military spending throughout their time. But you're going to see that it's continuing over time. And really, they didn't have the monetary ability to kind of keep up that pace of what they were doing. So, yeah, increasing military expenditures. Next, rising nationalism within the Soviet republics. We just mentioned how the countries that started getting rid of communism very, very quickly. And you can see here on this map, this actually shows each country and when they would actually get rid of or end the communist rule within those countries. So a lot of countries wanted to rule themselves, and they didn't want the Soviet Union and the communists to be in power anymore. 3, economic inefficiency of communism. Again, in Russia and throughout the Soviet Union, people were having issues, just getting basic food, and lots of different examples how communism was not working in those countries. And you saw that a lot economically. One of the interesting things to look at in history is, me being a car person, that the Soviet Union produced a lot of cars. I encourage you to look up information on those cars, because those cars were absolutely horrific cars and basically death machines. They were so unreliable and so unsafe. But yeah, so within the Soviet Union, again, very economically insufficient. Again, too much military spending. You're also going to see, because Gorbachev realized that economically things were not working the way that that would lead to long-term growth for the Soviet Union, he would institute a couple policies, one of them being perestroika, which reduced the communist government's power over the economy. And really the reason he did that was try to do more of a move towards a free market economic system, or at least a modified free market economic system, something like China had done. China, a communist nation, but moved more as economically using more free market principles. But anyway, when he made that shift, it would further hurt the economy that was already on the verge of collapse. So he made this big change, but again, really, I would say that you just didn't have enough time to kind of play out because the economy was already in such bad shape. So you're going to have the fall of the Berlin Wall, and this is going to be the one event that a lot of people kind of look at and say this was the fall of the Soviet Union right here. This is the end. The Berlin Wall, which had been up since JFK's administration, would fall on November 9th, 1989. I got a video there that shows the news stories actually talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in October of 1990, you're going to see that East and West Germany would reunite for the first time since 1945, which is pretty incredible. They had been separate countries for that long, and now they would be unified under one rule there. Now, the Berlin Wall there, again, it fell. If you're ever have a chance and you're like in Charlottesville, I know that UVA has an area out there where they actually have a big part of the Berlin Wall there on display that you can see. So, and you'll see that in museums kind of throughout the country, parts of the Berlin Wall there. So you will see the Soviet Union doesn't actually officially collapse until December 26, 1991, but kind of the symbolic end of the Soviet Union is the fall of the Berlin Wall. With the fall of the Soviet Union, you're going to see Gorbachev really no longer has this country to lead. The Soviet Union itself collapsing. So he is a man without a country, leaving the Russian president at the time, Boris Yeltsin. He is going to be the one that kind of takes over and takes over the reins of Russia during this time. And again, we tend to... when we talk about the Soviet Union, we think about Russia. Russia was just part of the bigger Soviet Union. Now, Russia did have the major power in behind it, but the Soviet Union was more than just Russia. So that's an important thing to understand there. Now, with the end of the Cold War, you're going to see some agreements to come out of this. Again, no longer this big fear over nuclear war now. And so both sides, both the United States and what was left of the Soviet Union, could begin working to eliminate some of these nuclear weapons. So Bush and Gorbachev would sign the START 1 agreement in 1991, which would reduce the number of nuclear warheads to 10,000 for each side. And then in 92, there would be START 2, which reduced the number of weapons to 3,000 on each side. The U.S., we would also offer economic assistance to Russia due to how poor the economy was there and how bad things were. We would offer that economic assistance to them. Bush, though, would remain very, very cautious as far as our foreign policy would go, because you would have an outbreak in civil war in some of these countries that had been communist. They get rid of communists, and you're going to have these different factions within the country that want power. So in Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, you were going to see a civil war break out in those countries. And that's actually going to be something that George H.W. Bush will have to deal with, and Bill Clinton will have to deal with some of the repercussions of that. Also, Bush's foreign policy. You'll see December 1989, U.S. troops were sent to Panama to remove the autocratic general Manuel Noriega from power. And the purpose of sending the troops there was to stop him from using his country as a drug pipeline to the U.S. U.S. troops would remain there until the elections established a more credible government in that country. And you're going to see, with the end of the Cold War, it's going to mark kind of a shift in U.S. foreign policy during this time, because now we didn't have our big geopolitical rival, the Soviet Union, around anymore. So now what would U.S. foreign policy look like? Ronald Reagan had kind of dictated, or he had spoken what he thought foreign policy should look like at the end of the Cold War. I talked about supporting humanitarian aid efforts around the world and supporting the cause of freedom all over the world. But George H.W. Bush is going to kind of be the first president since 1945, really, to have this, a new way of dealing with foreign policy, I should say. So the big event of George H.W. Bush's presidency is going to be the Persian Gulf War. This is actually something that I remember. Again, we're to the point of history where I was alive, where I remember this being in, I think, first grade, remembering when we watched our little news on TV in our classroom, them showing different things that were happening in the Persian Gulf War. So why do we get involved in fighting the Persian Gulf War? Well, in 1990, Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein would invade oil-rich Kuwait. You see there on the map, Kuwait's a very, very small country to the south of Iraq. Again, they didn't really have much of a military at all, but they did have a lot of oil, which Saddam Hussein wanted. Now, Bush, he wanted to do something about this. Again, it involves oil, which always draws any country in the world's interest, but especially ours. And he said, hey, let's build a coalition with the United Nations to pressure Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops from Kuwait. They did put a embargo against Iraq that did little, though, to change Saddam Hussein's mind. So as a result of that, Bush would win congressional approval for a military campaign to push Iraq out of Kuwait. And in January of 1991, you would have Operation Desert Storm begin. Now, this is going to be a very, very quick war, a very, very fast war. You'll see 5 weeks of airstrikes were followed by an invasion by General Norman Schwarzkopf. After only 100 hours of having troops on the ground, Iraq would concede defeat and withdraw from Kuwait. Now, one of the things that Iraq did as they retreated out of Kuwait was set a lot of the oil fields on fire. So if you look at that picture there at the bottom, you'll see a lot of the oil wells there are on fire. And if you've ever seen the movie, I think it's Jarhead, which talks about, or it revolves around the Persian Gulf War, you'll see with that, they show how they set so many of these things on fire that it actually was like raining oil down on the troops there. So Saddam Hussein would remain in power. We wouldn't actually drive into Iraq to take out the government there or anything like that. Our goal simply was to push Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, and that is what we did. So again, we would be successful in this because Kuwait would now be free from Iraqi occupation. Now, there were some people that did believe that George H.W. Bush should go ahead and push into Iraq and take Saddam Hussein out of power. Saddam Hussein, not a good guy, killed hundreds of thousands of his own people. But again, that wasn't the mission this time. The mission was to get them out of Kuwait. Now, this is an important war because it's going to be the first time where you're actually going to have women allowed to serve in combat in U.S. history. So again, fun fact for that. As far as Bush domestically, and you're going to see, again, talking about the Persian Gulf War, Bush emerges from this, his popularity at an all-time high. It looked like after this that he would easily win re-election in 1992. So what went wrong that he did not win re-election? So Bush's domestic and policy issues. Bush would name Clarence Thomas as the second African-American to serve on the Supreme Court. He would replace not Clarence Thomas. He would replace the first African-American on the court there. In 1990, Bush would violate his promise, though, of no new taxes by agreeing to accept the Democratic Congress's proposed $133 billion in new taxes. And these would be taxes on income, beer, wine, cigarettes, all kinds of different things increased. So again, this is going to be pretty easy for his enemies to use against him in the election of 1992. 1990 would also see the beginning of a recession, which would cause an increase in unemployment and a decrease in family incomes. This had partially been caused because of the savings and loan industry got into kind of a crisis, and that led some banks to fail, which hurt the economy. Really, the big thing, though, that's going to hurt Bush in all of this is going to be the basically now people are saying, you're a liar. You said, read my lips, no new taxes. And we've got taxes, which is why you see that cartoon there of George H.W. Bush looking like Pinocchio. Other things going on here domestically, you would see that Bush would sign the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, not Reagan, but Bush would sign that. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 to help deal with some of the environmental issues that were at that time. And you're going to see that throughout the recession that was happening in the country, that Bush would emphasize cuts in federal programs to help deal with the crisis. So saying, hey, the federal government needs to kind of rail back in its spending to hopefully deal with and handle this crisis. Now, with this and with what was going on in the economy, you're going to kind of see a big movement happen here in the country, and that's going to be the anti-incumbent sentiment. You're going to see a lot of sentiment against people that are sitting in the government in power for a long time. And I would argue you still see this today. It's interesting. If you look at people, if you ask them what kind of how good of a job Congress is doing, generally people are going to give Congress very, very a low approval. But if you ask them how their individual congressperson is doing, they generally give them a very, very high rate of approval. And with this, I think along with that goes this anti-incumbent sentiment. You might not have any problems with your senator or your congressman, but you don't like the others and you feel like that they're not getting their job done. So that is going to be added onto during this time because of the problems that you have in the economy, the huge budget deficits, and the political deadlock is going to fuel a lot of people being very unhappy with government. On the state level, you're going to see there would be a movement to impose term limits on elected officials. And the Supreme Court would rule in U.S. Term Limits Incorporated versus Thornton that states couldn't limit the tenure of federal lawmakers without a constitutional amendment. And again, I know I saw when I had you guys create an amendment a long time ago, there were several people that did amendments on term limits for people in Congress. Along with that, you're going to see the 27th Amendment passed. This is one that had been proposed at the original Constitutional Convention that prohibited members of Congress from raising their own salaries. Any salary increases for Congress do not go into effect until the next Congress. But again, you're going to see a lot of sentiment against these basically career politicians that you are going to see within government. So that brings us to the election of 1992. Of course, George H.W. Bush would be nominated by the Republicans. The Democrats would go a little bit different this time. They would select William Bill Clinton, the governor of Arkansas. He was chosen as their candidate. Clinton would be the first member of the baby boom generation to be nominated for president. So this is your first president born post 1945. Clinton would present himself as a moderate. He would call himself a new Democrat and use the tagline, "It's the economy, stupid," on the campaign trail and that kind of thing. And again, think about it. He could harp on the fact that Bush had raised taxes, even though he said he would not. Now, the interesting part about this election of 1992 is that you're going to have a third-party candidate that's going to be very, very popular. Ross Perot, he was a Texas billionaire. He had made a lot of money in the oil industry. He would enter the race as an independent running under what he called the Reform Party. Now, he had a lot of money to spend, and that he did. He would go on actually TV, and he would do these basically really long campaign ad shows where he'd talk about the economy, and that was what was going on. He would actually appeal to a lot of people because of his anti-Washington and anti-deficit views. Now, in the election of 1992, he would capture 20% of the vote, which would be the best showing of a third-party candidate since Teddy Roosevelt had run under the Bull Moose Party in 1912. So let's look at the campaign map here. Clinton would win the election despite only winning 42.9% of the vote. So he would win a plurality of the vote, or majority of the vote, but not a plurality of the vote. Now, this is largely going to be due to pro-pulling voters away from President Bush. A lot of these Reform Party voters probably would have voted for President Bush during that time, but because of some of Bush's, again, that whole, read my lips, no new taxes, and going back on that and that kind of thing, that had hurt his standing in the view of a lot of Republicans. And so a lot of them went over to Perot. So if you look at the actual numbers there, again, Perot, even though he didn't get any electoral college votes, he did enough to be able to sway the election, the direction of Bill Clinton there. So, you're going to see that these last couple of days here, we'll throw in a couple issues at the end that kind of span the period. Immigration is going to be one of those. So, how did immigration policy change in our country in the last part of the 20th century? You're going to see that Immigration Act of 1965. We talked about that before, how that got rid of the old quota system that you had in place starting in the 1920s. And this act is really going to open up immigration to places where people traditionally had not come from in big numbers because of limits on immigration, such as Asia and Latin America. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that would attempt to create a fair entry process for immigrants. You're going to see, though, that this law did a little to address the issue of illegal immigration. Again, that's something that had been an issue for quite a while, and politicians really have still haven't even figured out today a good way to handle that. And you'll see by the election, or by the year of 2000, 10.4% of the population would be foreign born. Why are they coming here? Again, if you look throughout U.S. history, why do immigrants come to our country? Political freedom and economic opportunity. We've talked about that since the very, very beginning when we talked about religious freedom for the Puritans, and then people coming into Jamestown to look for riches and gold and that kind of thing. Again, it's the same reason. This map right here, I forget what the organization it is that does this. They actually have a freedom index for countries around the world. And you can look how the United States, how us and like Australia and Great Britain, some of these countries that we are near the top of the freedom scale for the world. So again, that is what draws a lot of people here, is because of the freedoms that we have within this country. So how has rising immigration positively affected the United States? You're going to see a lot more diversity in a lot of different ways, the visual arts, literature, etc. Again, more diversity. The roles in the labor force. Again, minorities and immigrants play very important parts within our economy in in various roles. Again, you'll see a lot of Hispanics coming up, a lot of them coming to work in farms and the construction industry and that kind of stuff, in a lot of ways doing jobs that Americans don't want to do for that pay. So again, they have important roles in the labor force. Also, achievements in science, engineering, and other fields, again, coming over and help being leaders in those industries, and also being elected to public offices as well as immigrants coming into this country. Now, what are some of the problems relating to immigration that we have seen develop? One, the need for bilingual education. Again, as you have more people coming into the country that might not necessarily know English, that's caused within the field of education to have to deal with that and know, how can we best educate students that don't know English as their primary language? And that's why you have English as second language or English language learners programs that have popped up in schools. Two, strain on government services. A lot of times this is due to immigrants coming into the country that don't have the financial means that others do, and how they get plugged into the government services system and how that just puts a strain on that system. Three, the filling of low-paying jobs. Again, this causes issues for some because they say, hey, they're doing jobs that Americans would do, but because they will do it for a lower pay, Americans won't do those jobs, and that leaves Americans being jobless. Whether or not that's a big issue, studies have shown that's not really a huge issue, but for some, that is. Number four, border issues. Of course, we know that the southern border is one of those things. Donald Trump made that the hallmark of his campaign, but really the government has grappled with a long time, or struggled with, how do we control our southern border and how do we protect that southern border? Five, the pathway to citizenship. This has been another thing. President Obama tried to deal with that during his administration, didn't have a whole lot of luck, but what do we do for people coming into this country, especially people coming over the southern border, maybe illegally? Do we offer them a pathway to citizenship? What does that process look like? And what about the children of these people coming across the border. You'll have sometimes the term anchor baby, which is when someone pregnant comes over from Mexico or maybe some other Latin American country. They have their child here. Their child becomes a U.S. citizen, and then that gives them a right to all the advantages of any other American would have. So that's been a question too, is should the United States keep birthright citizenship, and what does that look like? So yeah, again, those are two questions, 4 and 5 there, that the government has no clue and hasn't really come up with a good solution. And then number 6, increasing cultural diversity. We talked about that being a positive, but it also can be a negative. In some areas, that has led to issues, usually in big cities, a lot of times on the West Coast, with gangs, and you get rival gangs. Usually, sometimes these gangs can be made up different ethnic groups. You got the Triads and the Latin Kings, two different groups out there. So these cultural diversity, while it can be good in some ways, it can also be negative in some places, especially when you have a lot of poverty, which you'll see more crime with that, and gangs popping up as a result. So we left off here, again, talking about immigration, but as well as the election of 1992. So next class, we are going to jump into talking about Bill Clinton and the 1990s. I hope you have a fantastic day.